Hello, and a very warm welcome to the programme. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Where is the money going to come from? All around the world, governments are borrowing and borrowing to buy their way out of the coronavirus crisis. And someone, somewhere, surely has to pay. This is Roundtable. When the viral economic dust starts to settle, are we going to see a return to austerity as after the 2008 crash? Unlikely seems to be the answer.
As the coronavirus spreads across the world, the global economy is facing its worst crisis since the Great Depression. The pandemic is expected to inflict long-term damage across the world. COVID-19 is forcing the UK into a recession unprecedented in modern times, and lifting the lockdown of society and the economy is proving difficult. The UK government is expected to be almost $400 billion in deficit by the time this is over. Tax revenues are falling and public spending surging. The last time the country was in anything like this position was the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, when deep spending cuts were introduced. Many commentators say more austerity is not the answer this time, with some pushing for public investment to create jobs and opportunity. Tax rises are also a real possibility. As governments around the world plummet into more debt, what can be done to reverse the crash, and where will the money come from?
Very pleased to say that joining us on the programme we have Yael Selfin, Chief Economist at the accountancy firm KPMG. She's in London. Also in that city, Anastasia Nesvetailova, an expert on financial crises from City University. And we welcome also Sarah Arnold from the New Economics Foundation. Same question to each one of you, but I'll start with you, Anastasia, if I may. Has coronavirus changed all the rules?
It's too early to say, unfortunately, with really crisis of this magnitude that very few people had ever imagined, but also all the uncertainty. It's like that wisdom when Mao, I think somebody asked Mao, what are the lessons of the French Revolution? And they clearly asked him in the 20th century. He said, it's too early to say. So I'm afraid we're not even out of this particular dip in the crisis to understand what are the rules, to what extent they've been changed, what is the difference between rules and institutions. So a lot of things will have to adapt, but we're not even sure which questions to ask at this stage.
Okay, well, that's my job on this program. So I'll start with come to Yael now and say, look, if we don't know exactly where we are, is it clear that some things will have changed forever financially when it comes to international debt and countries' way of dealing with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in every recession, we see a change afterwards. Is a well before and after a recession doesn't tend to be the same. This is going to be a very deep recession, so even more so. And then you need to bear in mind that we came to it slightly differently. It's a health shock. It's not an economic or business shock. It's going to be very large, and the interventions that are taking place are very different because it's a health shock. We have a lockdown. This is unprecedented, and the social distances around it and after the lockdown are going to be very different. And ultimately, it is going to be very severe. So everything will be different.
Okay, Sarah, let me come to you. And then the same question, but also the follow up to that is, where do you think we should go to get out of this hole?
Yeah, so where I think we have seen at least some change from, I guess, a break with the last couple of years is that it's kind of exposing the rules that we're following as a society, and the fact that we can make changes to this. So the government, particularly the UK government and elsewhere, have done a lot to preserve the current structures of the economy in terms of protecting jobs and protecting businesses by massive scales of intervention that we haven't seen in a very long time. But many have fallen through the gaps. We're seeing millions of unemployed people. And many of these people are those that are least able to weather the crisis, people in precarious work, young people, people in low incomes. And so we need to support them. The government needs to do all it can to prevent another Great Depression when the economy starts to unfreeze again and these support schemes need to unwind. And so we need new solutions. We need things like an income guarantee, and we need large-scale public investment. We need an investment-led recovery going forwards.
I'd like to ask you all about austerity in just a moment, but first take a look at this. These are the UK figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility. The UK economy output down 35%. It's estimated between April and June of this year. Unemployment up 10%, perhaps even more than that. 7 million workers sent home. A public spending deficit that's 50% higher than after 2008, the crash then, and public borrowing somewhere between 300 billion, which we know about at the moment, and 500 billion as a possibility. Anastasia, would you say that before this, the UK economy was back on track? Quick answer to that one.
No, the crisis hit the economy in quite a fragile state. We haven't dealt properly with the legacy of the 2009 crisis, with the previous financial crisis. The economy was vastly different to that time. At the time, public spending was robust. There were quite sharp interventionist policies, at least on the monetary side. And it is the public sector that really sustained the aggregate demand through what they would call recovery, probably.
Okay, so in your eyes, austerity didn't work?
Definitely not. It was quite fatal.
Okay, and Yael, your thoughts on that? Had we got to a stage where we could say actually Britain is pretty much okay now, and that might have demonstrated that austerity had been successful?
No,
well, I think it really depends on how you look at it. I think if you look at full employment, we had very low unemployment rate. We probably reached some sort of full capacity, but where we were short on is innovation and productivity that was still low.
Okay, so austerity didn't work. I think all three of you agree with that. So if that is the case, Sarah, let me come to you. What this time around?
Yeah, so I think as I referred to a bit earlier, austerity was a failed experiment that didn't work. It was a poor policy choice in terms of leading to any kind of recovery, but it was also a failed choice because it led to huge societal damage in terms of weakening of the public services that would have collectively supported us against this risk. But in terms of what we need to go forward, the government must do all it can to prevent another, Great Depression when the economy starts to unfreeze again. And the solution is very high levels of public investment. So kind of every pound that the government spends, if they spend it on sensible investment, can bring in multiple times that in tax revenue and to support sustainable growth to allow us to recover. And we need investments that support and create jobs and gives business confidence to invest. So examples of that.
So are you of the school, the John Maynard Keynes school, look after unemployment and the budget will look after itself, I think he said during the Great Depression?
Pretty much. And I also think that the reason why the government should be kind of thinking about further borrowing right now is that we have very rock bottom interest rates pretty much. So even if the debt doubles, and I haven't seen anyone predicting close to that, the cost of servicing the debt, so the annual cost to the taxpayer, will actually still be lower than at any time in the 20th century. And the cost of doing nothing, of not kind of investing and ensuring that we do recover and that people are not left behind. The cost of doing that, leaving people to struggle in hardship, is astronomical. So the government must do all it can to prevent that.
Where has the mood against austerity come from? Because David Blanchflower, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee here in the UK, who was going to be on this programme with you, has described it as reckless austerity, which was imposed on the country, strangling growth, the slowest peacetime recovery for 300 years. Where has the mood shifted? Your thoughts on that first, and then Anastasia.
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of things here. Number one, that was already alluded to, that actually the cost of debt is very low. So there's a recognition is that if you invest well, you might actually generate stronger growth later on. There's also recognition that we need to get better at how we do things. So we do need to invest more in our infrastructure. What type of infrastructure depends a little bit on the changing time. It's probably less transport infrastructure now. It's more telecommunication infrastructure now that we need to get right with broadband and 5G, etc. And there's also recognition that we do need to invest more in education across all the level, as well as retraining of the workforce, because we are going to pivot into new way of doing things, and that would require retraining people, and the way we do work will change as a result of that.
You see, the question I have, and I don't know whether non-economists out there like me would have the same question, is if you keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, who are you borrowing from? And how will you pay it back, or is it ever paid back? Anastasia, give us the idiot's guide to economics for that question.
Well, the question is, who do you owe the debt to? And the other trick is to see the debt not as only as a burden, but as a mobilizing factor for growth and investment. The other side of debt is always credit, and without credit, no economy would ever work. One of the key priorities even now for the government, for the central bank, for the treasury, has been to keep the credit flow, the liquidity flow going. And it is only in contemporary economies, this is done only through debt. All our money is a form of debt. So we cannot really escape it. It's just our either intuitive, or if you want, paradigmatic attitude to debt is really quite sinful. We understand it's something very bad, and that eventually would need to be paid back. It depends who the debt is to. Your national
debt. So will more money have to be printed, which may well lead to inflation?
Not all money needs to be printed, not even now. There is a big question what counts as money. And the risk of inflation at the moment is very low. There is a high risk of deflation, which would be a real killer for any economic prospect in any economy. And deflation is price down.
There are 3 Italian economists. You may well have read this book. It's called Austerity, When It Works and When It Doesn't. They looked at 16 different countries, and they concluded that cutting spending was far more effective than raising taxes. Now, presumably one of those will have to be done, Sarah, will it not?
Well, as I said, there's a lot more can be done in terms of borrowing and to invest in the kinds of things that will allow the economy to grow. And then that will make it much easier to pay back that debt. There's different ways of growing your tax revenue. And one way is to raise incomes, and therefore you will raise the tax that you get from things like income tax. But also, yes, potentially in the long term, we are maybe going to have to raise taxes to support, I guess, the level of public spending on our services that I think there's quite a strong collective appetite for. As this crisis has exposed, it's incredibly valuable to have a working public health system that is able to support us in times of need. And so that we will need taxes to pay for that. I think the trick is to think about which taxes we raise or who that burden falls on. I think there's a lot of opportunity, at least in the UK and probably elsewhere, to think about sources of revenue that we haven't traditionally taxed very highly. So right now, wealth, so things like assets, are taxed at a much lower rate than income. So we should think about potentially taxing some of those. And we can also think about other taxes that help shape the kind of consumption that we might want going forward. So some kind of green tax, a carbon tax. So I think there are other opportunities there as well.
So you see taxes rather than spending cuts, and yet the German economic minister, Peter Altmaier, he said this on March the 20th. His government has since changed tack, by the way. This is what he said on March the 20th. Once the crisis is over, and we hope this will be the case in several months, we will return to austerity policy and as soon as possible to a balanced budget policy. Germany being very keen on not being in debt. So you think it'll be taxes that have to be raised, not, as he's suggesting, cutbacks?
Well, I think this thought about this kind of idea around a balanced budget comes from this mistaken analogy between a government budget and a household budget. A government budget is not like a household budget, and it makes intuitive sense that a household budget needs to be balanced in the long term. But a government budget is slightly different in that government has a much larger effect on the economy. And so by government spending is also people's wages often. The government pays the wages of our health workers, of our social care, and so on. And by spending more on them, it gets money back in tax revenue. So by investing and spending money, the government can get back stuff in revenue. And so it's not quite the same thing. So although there are some kind of there are some kind of things that are similar, there are many things that are very different. And so in order to kind of
So the
have a
same
sustainable
rules do
economy in the
not
long
apply.
term, yeah,
That is
same rules
one
do
thing
not
we
apply.
are establishing here. The same things do not apply. Anastasia and Yael on this one. If David Blanchflower described George Osborne's policies as reckless austerity, is there such a thing as reckless spending? And who decides what is and what isn't? Who wants to go first?
I don't mind going first. I think there is recognition at the moment that the spending that the UK government is taking is the right thing to do, in the sense that the support that the economy needs at the moment is really required, and ultimately the reason why the economy is where it is to a great extent due to the government measures in the sense of the lockdown. And we want to shield as many businesses as possible. Once that phase is over, though, we need to try and understand where the support is needed and where the support is actually going to help us out in the medium to long term. So we all, I think there's a vast agreement in favor of spending, but we just need to make sure that we spend it in a way that provides us with the best value for money, and we don't just push problems further down the line without resolving them.
See, I'm wondering why austerity, and I did mention this earlier, has gone out of fashion so very quickly.
Oh, I'm afraid it wasn't quick enough. It has done a lot of damage. It's been really with us since the first Tory government was elected. I think it was 2010. I think, going back to your previous question, I would agree with Yael that, of course, it's a question of priorities, but one of the big mistakes would be, especially in the current political context, to trust business and the banking system. The previous formula, when massive credit was advanced to the banks, relying on them to pass it on back or further into the economy, really created a massive asset inflation, new sides of distinction between wealth and poverty that Sarah spoke about, and that it's very dangerous, and really misdirected funds into what you would call, if you want, reckless investment or unconditionally supported businesses that really...
Let me rephrase it then. Not so much why has
Yeah.
austerity gone out of fashion. If it was brought in by Cameron and Osborne and the Tory party, and we also saw it in Greece imposed by central powers of the European Union, such as Germany, why was it initially so popular?
Because it's intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. If you compare any state, any country to a family budget, in times of crisis, you need to tighten your belt and to cut your spending. But no government, especially a government which has some power over its monetary policy, i.e. the currency, or it can borrow cheaply in the markets, it can never be compared to a family budget.
But you see, the thing is, exactly, this is what Sarah has said. You cannot compare the two. And senior politicians with their trusted advisors, who were presumably pretty intelligent economists, did put this forward.
I would doubt
they were comparing family budgets to national debt. Why?
Because it's a line that was easily sold to the public. The public, who may not be economically literate or curious, they emotionally they sympathize with that. They themselves are households and families. They have to tighten their belts if they hit hard times. It's a very emotive line politically, but it's economically illiterate. And I'm sure they know.
So, Sarah, do you think the politicians themselves, those people who imposed austerity on a number of different societies, were doing it just to appease the electorate, rather than because it was something in which they themselves believed?
I can't comment on who believed what. I think to add to what Anastasia was saying, though, is that for some people it might well have been an ideological choice, because not every politician wants a big state. Not every politician likes the idea of spending a lot on public services. And so one way of shrinking the state is to kind of go for these austerity policies. And it was an excuse to cut spending to public services and to cut spending to welfare and social security. But I think it's very clear now that it was a choice that failed. And so that's why it's gone out of fashion, as you say. It's so clearly the evidence from many different countries around the world over the past decade has been that it absolutely has not worked.
Did I hear one of the other of you wanting to get in?
I just wanted to say that we just need to be a little bit cautious because these are very, very early days. I think it's all very well and good when we know that the public sector needs to spend more, and we all support it. But when eventually there will be a time in the medium term where taxes will need to rise, we will need to see how the public react to that. I'm not that sure whether there'll be just as much. There probably will be more than before, but there may not be as much support for it, all depending on how they see that money spent in future. It's not that clear cut to me.
Okay, future prospects. And here we have the International Monetary Fund saying the global economy this year shrinking 3% before growing by 5.8% next year. That's not a very big return, but it's a great deal better than a lot of people might have thought at the beginning of all of this. Anastasia, do you hold with that we will see a global return to growth? And if so, what would that mean?
I'm afraid I cannot even comment on these figures. They might be very wrong. They had been wrong before, massively. Before the 2007 financial crisis, they predicted an economic boom globally. That was 2006. So I'm sure they learned on their models and how to do the variables, but it looks to me the 3% calculation is very conservative. I think it can be very much worse. And I think growth of 5% next year, I mean, it will depend massively on China. And China has already suggested that it's not publishing its forecast. So I think it's very premature and sounds very optimistic.
Do you all agree that employment is the big driver here, that you have to get people back into work, and that should be done no matter what? Quick one from you, Sarah. We're running out of time. We'll go around the panel.
No, I absolutely think stuff should be done to support people out of work and to think about how people can safely return to employment. But I don't think we should be getting people back into employment while we still have no cure for this virus if they cannot do so safely. The priority should be health, and then we can protect the economy through that. But a return to work too quickly may cause a second outbreak, and we need to be really cautious about making sure people can do so safely.
You see, Yael, the argument against that could well be if people are kept out of work for safety reasons or whatever, the economy won't recover quickly enough, they become dependent upon the state, and then there's no real incentive to get back, and you don't see a return to growth and security.
So, I mean, just linked to your earlier question as well on the IMF forecast, it's really all depends on when we get a vaccine, when we get some proper testing, tracing, and any antiviral medicines that will allow us to eradicate this pandemic, or at least make it less dangerous than what it is now and less disruptive than what it is now. Once we have that, we have a recovery and we can gradually go back to normal. But governments need to focus on getting the health side sorted first and to increase cooperation internationally in order to be able to get that throughout the world.
Anastasia, do you think we will ever, those of us lucky enough to live in the developed world, see a return to the levels of prosperity that we enjoyed 6-8 months ago? And what would that mean to future generations?
We might. The question is at what cost? Prosperity is an aggregate term. It describes society, but in that society, ultimately, some people will be more rich and some people will be more poor. And as you were talking about priorities of employment, health, and security, the real political choice is about those priorities. Of course, health, public health is the utmost priority. But it might well be that we are going to a new economic era where employment will be a different type of a societal engagement, really.
Okay, so it's all about where you live, depending upon what kind of prosperity you get. Sarah, is this a chance to even things out? Or will the less advantaged become even more disadvantaged?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now, that those on the sharp edge of this crisis are often the people who are already more disadvantaged and who are at the sharp edge of the previous austerity policies. So I think the government has a choice on how the shape of our recovery. And I think it's really important that we do think about the policies that support those who most need it and that we don't leave people behind. And so that looks like things like strengthening social security policies, thinking very carefully about our tax structures, and making sure that growth, when it does happen, or if it does happen, is distributed fairly across the economy.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. I think the one thing we all agree on is that the rules as of 6 months ago no longer apply, and the rules as of 2008 certainly do not apply. Appreciate very much you taking the time to come on this edition of Roundtable, and thank you for watching. Thank you for taking the time to take in all our expert opinions. From me, David Foster, from the team that made all of this possible, from my guests, we hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.